Hi, my name is Trevor Calabro. I am a senior user experience strategist here at the Aten Design Group, and I want to talk to you briefly about some simple things you can do that'll make a huge impact for your website's visitors. Now, when it comes to this presentation, it is based off of my 15 plus years of experience as a user experience professional. And over that time, people have come to me and said, Trevor, I try to Google these things and I find a whole bunch of random information. So what I've done is I've distilled the things that I've internalized that I use the most in my day-to-day work, and I try to distill it down into some actionable and easy to understand packaging that's jargon free. So this presentation is specifically intended for people that make websites who aren't user experience professionals. Now, if you are a user experience professional, I encourage you to watch anyway. I mean, I have some ideas in here that may be a new way to frame, a new way to look at these things. So I encourage you to watch all the way through, as well as this is not only a presentation, it also has some downloads. So I encourage you to download the PDFs associated with this. They are workbooks and things that'll help you execute these in the real world. So the agenda for today is I want to do a brief and incomplete history of UX. Then I've distilled the principles. Now, in user experience, we have these things called laws. So I took the 7 laws that I use most, and I want to communicate those to you. And then lastly, I packaged it all up into a framework, a 3 easy step framework for implementing these laws on your own projects. So let's get started here with the history. David Kelly. David Kelly, we're going to zoom right all the way up to the advent of the internet. So David Kelly of IDEO fame, he spearheaded this, the design thinking framework. Now, if you're not familiar with this or you don't use design thinking, I highly encourage you to look into it. I'm certain most of you have seen something like this. Usually design thinking is these 5 linear buckets and then an idea of some iteration in there. But all the variations have some semblance of this. Now, the reason I talk about this is a great framework to use to design anything. So this is the design. It's used by all major companies that make major products for the most part in today's world. You can use this to make websites like we're going to talk about today, but you could also use this methodology to, plan your 3-year-old's birthday party. It is a ubiquitous framework that can fit on top of anything. Next, I want to talk about Don Norman. Don Norman invented the term user experience. He also started the first UX department within a large company at Apple Computers. So at his time at Apple and afterwards, he met Jakob Nielsen, and those two teamed up to form the Nielsen Norman Group. Now, the Nielsen Norman Group is the world's foremost think tank about all usability matters, and they're research based. So there's 3-4 decades worth of research baked into every single recommendation that they make. And I'm going to frame this entire presentation around their methodologies and their research. So if Don Norman came up with the term user experience, Jakob Nielsen defined usability, and we're going to talk about his definition. But also, he wrote the preeminent book about web usability. So when it comes to website usability, these 3 are kind of the trifecta and the base of what we're going to talk about. And these 3 guys, like user experience is such a new profession that they still work today. They are still acting practitioners. This here is a picture of me when I met Jakob Nielsen in 2017. I had the opportunity to be trained by Jakob Nielsen. And also, if anyone has any tips on how not to ruin, the one selfie you get with your hero, that would be great. So contact me on that one. Let's talk about Jacob's definition of usability. So he breaks usability down into 5 components. Learnability. So learnability, I also think about this as discoverability, if you've heard people talk about discoverability. So this just means once users find everything they need, how easy is it for them to figure out the system that you've put together? So can users find stuff and can they learn stuff? Efficiency. This is how quick do users do stuff in your design? So once they've learned the system, how long does it take them to execute a full task? Memorability. This is what the users remember upon returning to your design. So if they leave your website and they come back, can they still do things? Is it more efficient? Those ideas. Errors. How common is user error in your design? And how easy is it for users to fix those errors once they've accidentally made them? And then lastly, satisfaction. Do users like it? How pleasant is the design to use? Now, these 5 factors are the framework we're going to use to discuss all the UX principles. So now onto the print. In UX, we have many, many, many laws. So if you were to Google this, you'll find tons and tons of stuff. There's hundreds of thousands of articles based on this stuff. And mostly they're written by academics. And a lot of the stuff is written a long time ago. So what I've done is I've distilled the ones that I use that have the biggest impact on a daily basis. So this is not comprehensive by any means, but this will get you very far along the way if you adopt these 7 things. And also, I've tried to reword them from the academic version into the way I think about them. I think it might be useful. So, law 1, fits as law. Here is the academic definition. This one always seemed to confuse me. Here's the way I think of it. Put stuff as close to the user's cursor as possible and make the most important things bigger. So I think of this as just-in-time design. Law number 2, the law of the magic pixels. This one has many different names. I like this name the best. It seems to stick in people's minds. Here's the academic definition, the way I think of it. Users look for stuff in the corners and have an easy time reaching the corners. So I want to take a pause here and note that law number 1 and law number 2 are in total contradiction with one another, right? You have Fitz's law, which says put stuff as close to the cursor or finger if you're on a mobile device. And then this one, the law of the magic pixels, it says put stuff in the corners. So I want to note that these laws work together. They weave together to make meaningful experiences. So this is why in the primary navigation of your website, it's good to put things in the order from left to right that your users will engage with things. So home, about, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then you've seen like a buy button in the top right-hand corner. These things work together. And I want you to keep that in mind as you work on your own designs. Next, we'll talk about the 3rd law, Hick's law. Here's the academic definition. And the way I think of it is just break stuff into categories and steps, like sequential steps if necessary, whenever your content gets real complicated. Law number 4, the law of progressive disclosure. Here's the academic definition. Here's how I think of it. Show users what they want when they want it. Once again, I love to pair 3 and 4 together. So progressive disclosure and Hick's law work very nicely. If you categorize things and then show things to the user as they need them, so think of a dropdown. So you click the label of a dropdown and then it gets more information as they click. And those dropdowns are categorized. So multiple dropdowns is Hick's law. The dropdown itself is the law of progressive disclosure. It makes a very meaningful and user-centered experience. Next, let's talk about law 5, Miller's law. Now, I'm going to spend some time. This one is the most misunderstood law. So I want to describe it by what it's not. So you've probably heard this, right? 7 plus or minus 2. It doesn't mean that all your list should be 7 items or less, right? What it does mean is don't make people remember stuff. Don't put stuff in their working memory. So don't make them think too hard. A good example of this is, and I'm sure you've seen this, anytime you have a form field that has placeholder text, that gray text that's italicized, that gives some really important formatting information. So by the time you click into the field, that information goes away and you no longer know how to format what you're typing. So it makes the user stop, memorize the format, and then try to type it in. And that's just a very terrible user experience. And I'm sure you've seen this in the real world. If you ever see a user stop the user experience from your website, take out a pen and paper and start writing stuff down, that's a clear red flag that there's a breach of Miller's law. Next, law 6, the law of affordances and signifiers. This is directly from Don Norman's work. So he coined the term affordances and the term signifiers. Affordances are, and here's the way I think of it, is make stuff look like what it does, right? So this button on the right is an example. The button itself, the red rounded corners of a rectangle, it's got a slight gradient, there's a slight drop shadow. Those things, the button itself is the affordance. And then the label up and the up arrow icon are signifiers that describe the button. So the thing that looks like a button tells the users this is clickable, and the label and the icon tell users what it does when you click it. Now, am I saying that all buttons must look like this? No, I'm just saying users, 99 out of 100 people would look at that and understand that it's clickable right away. And that's what we mean by affordance. Now, now that I told you this, you're going to see this in the real world. Uh-oh, right? You got your now no one would do this up and down, right? But this creates a cognitive dissonance. You'll see this many times where people try to take the icon and the label and try to have new meaning as the two combine. That actually falls a little bit into Miller's law, right? Where you're making people think too much. So I want you to really, really notice this in the real world and make sure that if you're going to add an icon, make sure it plays well with your label. Next law, law number 7, and the last one we'll talk about today is Jacob's law. This is Jakob Nielsen's law. It's actually written fairly well from an academic standpoint. Here's how I think of it. Don't reinvent the wheel. Use standard design patterns that you see on most other websites. So here's how this one works out in the real world. Someone comes to me and says, but Trevor, I designed this off of a sample I saw on Google, so it should be fine. And that's kind of a misuse of Jacob's law. What Jacob's law says is look at many different websites that do the same or similar thing that you're trying to do and see what those common patterns are. Now, there are a couple gotchas in the world. There are some pervasive user patterns that have made it into the wild that don't follow the Nielsen Norman Group recommendations. So keep an eye out for those. But for the most part, I think of law number 7, Jacob's law, as the king of all laws. This one you can it lays on top of all the others, especially if you're new to user experience. Just defer to Jacob's law when in question. And then, of course, we have a bonus. Here's a bonus concept. It's not really a law. I couldn't fit it in, but it's this idea of the F-shaped reading pattern. So users often read web pages in the shape of a capital letter F, as you see here. I'll give you an example. This is eye tracking heat map from a Google research search page results. Now, the F shape isn't the only pattern. There's many patterns. There's the layer cake. There's the zigzag. There's the lawnmower. They all have these silly names, but they most of them rely on this idea that users do not read your website content like a book. They scan it, right? So if you just design everything off of this idea of the F-shaped pattern, it'll work out fine for you. So just think about the F-shape as you go. So the F-shape is here. The user started in the top left, something caught their eye, so they started to scan across till they got to number 2. They realized nothing was of value here, so they go back to the spine. Something catches their eye at number 3. They read all the way across until they hit number 4, and they go back. And then they rinse and repeat this pattern over time. So now let's transition into how do we take those 7 things, plus the bonus, and put them into some framework that you can use, some kind of actionable thing that you can do today. So step 1, audit your designs. So simply check your current designs against the laws we just talked about. And guess what? This design thinking that David Kelly came up with, it works perfectly with this. So I want you to take your 5-step process that you're doing today, and in step 1 and 2, lay on this. Pick what you want to fix or evaluate, and then audit that design against the 7 principles, 7 laws. Next, step 2, prototype your new design. So build a simplified version of the new design based off of your educated first best guess. And what I mean by that is it's educated because you're using the Nielsen Norman Group recommendations and those 7 laws that I just detailed. But it's a guess because you haven't actually talked to any real users. You don't know how it works in the wild yet. So you just, you make a paper prototype, and that fits right here in the design thinking methodology perfectly. Now I have low or a high fidelity here. I want to focus on the low because a lot of pushback about usability that I get from people is we don't have enough time and we don't have enough budget to do it. So I want to encourage you, this could be done at a very short amount of time at a very low budget. So let's focus on the low fidelity. And a great example of this is paper prototypes. So all a paper prototype is you just draw out different screens very quickly on a sheet of paper. This here, if you turn your head, this is a picture showing an example of a paper prototype. You can see 2 different screens there that are just drawn out. This probably took a matter of minutes for a designer to come up with. And then step 3, you need to test your designs. Test your assumptions that you made in your paper prototypes. I love this quote from Jakob Nielsen. It's important to test users individually and let them solve problems on their own. So what does that mean? Oh, and by the way, this fits perfectly into the design thinking methodology as well. So what does this mean? Let's take those 5 components that Jakob uses to define usability, and how do we test these? So learnability, you simply test by watching real users execute real world tasks. You set up a real world task, you ask them to conduct that task, and you sit back and watch. Efficiency, okay, you're going to see a pattern here. It's the exact same thing, except you use a timer because efficiency is about time. Memorability, exact same thing, except you do it over multiple sessions because they have to leave and return. Errors, all you do is the same thing. You watch and see where mistakes are made. And then satisfaction, you do the same thing once again, except you follow up with a survey because this is about user perception. You're asking the user, how did you feel about that? What is your satisfaction level? So as you can see, you can get all 5 components if you just are to run a usability test. A usability test is where you take 5 representative users and you run them through real world tasks. And by run them, I mean you describe a real world task and watch them try to execute it on your product. And then you'll get all 5 bits of usability vetted by the real users. So that's why it's the 3rd step in the process. So step 1, audit your site. Step 2, redesign based on your first best educated guess. And then step 3, get it in front of real users. And the idea here is it's very simple. It's quick and easy. If you have enough budget to test 15 users, instead of doing one large test with 15 people, break it up into 3 mini tests with 5 people. So your first best educated guess then turns into your first best guess based off of user input for the second test. And then the third one is based on that 3rd iteration, that new design. So remember, design thinking has that iterative kind of loop in it. That's what this is all about. You're taking the edge of a sword and just sharpening it ever so slightly every time, but it greatly increases the usability of your website. So I want to revisit this example definition of a paper prototype. So draw different screens of your website on separate sheets of paper. And in step 3, facilitate people executing tasks on those. That's what I mean by usability test. This is how simple it can be. Look, this picture here, it's not only a good example of a paper prototype, but it's also an example of a test in progress. So on the left, you see the test facilitator, and on the right, you see a test participant. That person's using a pen as a cursor, and they're saying, I'm clicking on this button, and the facilitator would then say, okay, by clicking that button, we'll swap out this piece of paper with that piece of paper. How much easier could it get? And this is real user-centered design methodology. So I want to wrap things up with some final thoughts. If I haven't convinced you that it's easy to do and it's worth your time, think of it like this. Usability is a large chunk of accessibility. So if you want to prove to the world, to your customers, to your visitors, that you aren't discriminatory against people who have interesting and unique ways to engage with your website, then start by these usability principles. They will get you a long way when it comes to accessibility. And then lastly, you are not the user. This is the #1 rule of usability. So I want you to think about that. Like, I want you to think about the labels you use for your progressive disclosure, for your dropdowns. Think about using explicit and relevant labels instead of labels the way you think of it. Label things the way your user thinks of it, because just all said and done, you're too close to the experience. You want to make the experience good for all, not just good for you and people deep down in knowledgeable of your company, your product, your website. So with that said, I want to thank you. I hope this was informative. Again, feel free to reach out to me or anyone else on the Aten team at any time about these things. Remember to download the supplemental materials. They will help you execute these things in the real world, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.